Microsoft releases a major update to our finance and operations platform every spring and fall. We call them waves, henceforth the beautiful graphic of a wave that we have on this slide. The Wave 2 2022 documentation is available and has been available for some time now. We typically wait a little bit so that we can take a look at the features and understand them before we do our presentation, instead of just reading through the documentation, as you probably have already possibly done. But at the same point, I have linked it in here, so that way if you want to go into it and look at some of the documentation in more detail, obviously it's a great place to go to get that. To top that off as well, guys, just so you know, typically these release plans are published a couple months ahead of the actual introduction of the functionality, because remember, general availability for a lot of these features is actually October 1st, right, for this. Now, each of these features as well have different dates where they may be available. So that documentation will actually allow you to understand when that's going to occur, when it's in preview versus generally available, and also links then to the documentation that's related to it. So just as a heads up, go take a look at it. Make sure for every installation that you have that you're looking at this information ahead of time. You'll see as well that it's not just the finance and operations platform that has this, but it's also HR, commerce, SMB, like Business Central, along with sales, service, and marketing. All of those plans are actually there for you to be able to access. So with that, today, one of the things I just want to start with saying is that we're really looking at the middle component here for our change notes and diving more into finance and operations. Note that we have other webinars that we do for the customer engagement, which typically then includes like the Dataverse Power Platform, for example, sales, marketing, service or field service, so to speak. Like that's the customer engagement platform. The finance and operations platform, you'll see some people call it finance. You'll hear some people call it supply chain management. Remember, those are products on that platform. That's what we're going to be covering in more depth today. And then secondarily, the Business Central solution, or BC as we call it as well, is an SMB platform that's basically designed for small and medium businesses, right? So each of these different platforms have release notes that are related to them. But today, as we have said, we're going to dive more into the finance and operations perspective. Now, with finance and operations, there's a couple of other products that are on here as well that we're not including in here. So an example of that would be the intelligent order management, and then also the project operations, right? So today, because of our limited amount of time, we wanted to make sure that we covered at least the finance and supply chain and even the cross-app capabilities between these particular apps on the finance and operations platform. And that's a really cool concept to start talking through that we see evolving even more over time here. And I just want to kind of let the audience know really about this. More specifically, remember, finance and operations is a platform. It is like Microsoft Windows, where you can install applications on Windows to extend then functionality on your desktop, right? Same concept exists here within finance and operations. You can buy finance separate than supply chain. You can implement supply chain separate from finance, right? So these are basically software as a service-based applications that allow you to then phase your implementation, reduce risk, but at the same point, because they're on the same type of platform, there are general enhancements basically to the platform that apply then to all those particular products. We call those cross-app capabilities typically in those release notes. So if you want to know architecturally what's changing, if you're more technical in nature, a lot of the platform concepts are actually introduced in the cross-app capabilities, whereas if you're more of an end user, typically you're going to dig down then into the product-specific scenarios like finance or supply chain management inside of here, because those are typically feature enhancements that are business process functionality enhancements, as opposed to just technical, general quality of life or API type enhancements, right? So that being said, let's go ahead and jump in right away, though, into really our cross-app capabilities that are inside of here, because candidly, there's some nice ones that are coming through from a quality of life type perspective. So we'll start with our cross-app capability. So first and foremost, you can see on the screen here, I actually have one of the actual pages exposed here that is our cross-grid capability inside of Dynamics 365 Finance and Operations. So our grids, for example, when we first introduced the grid concepts with Rainier, basically at AX7, they didn't have as many of the features that you pretty much have now that hopefully you're using and you've enabled. And candidly, we're going to talk a little bit more as well about what's coming, for example, with the cross-app capabilities that is making some of this now mandatory inside of an environment. So on the far right here, you can see a view, and we've got, for example, freeze columns that were introduced with this new grid control. You've got the ability to do grouping. So you can see right there that they're actually grouping by credit limit. But the other aspect of this is that there's totals that can now be basically controlled on these particular controls. So you can see here, for example, we have a credit limit that is actually being averaged. So we can see what the average credit limit is in each of the groups as well, as you can see. So before it used to be just kind of a total based concept, but now we can do minimums, we can do maximums, and we can do averages. So that way you can create a better look and feel really to be able to drill down and access data and group it so that you can see the information very quickly and easily. And the example I love to give here is that the average for your excellent credit rated customers is around 375,000, where your average for good credit rated customers is around 292,000, right? This is information that typically before you'd have to export to Excel, you'd have to do obviously a pivot off of it, you'd have to add all the columns. Well, with this grouping and also with these totaling capabilities, there's a really nice feature in here where you can just do it on the screen without having then to go to another application to see that information. So definitely a quality of life enhancement that's there. The other thing I wanted to mention, this might impact more of you that do some of the active development inside of your there are some performance enhancements that they've added then to those saved views. So at the top left on this screen, there's the My View. And as most of you know, if you click down on that caret and you actually access it, you'll see then, for example, really the, the view concepts where you can save them. And the problem with that has been that there's been some performance aspects of it. And what they've done is they've changed, for example, how some of the data is actually gathered for these particular views. So if you develop in this, just know that there is a change here that they've made, that the on-post run handler, that's kind of a form control on here, it actually runs now after the query is executed, where before it would actually run before. So, with these grid enhancements, if you've got customizations that you've done to them, you may just want to bring it up and say, hey, if we added this page, are we doing anything on post run? It's not as typical, to be honest, but you should just know that there are some changes in that regard with it. Kind of moving along here then from the cross app capabilities. Typically, I like to go through and tell you what's mandatory, what's enabled by default, what's generally available for this particular release. So when we look at this release now, we are at the 10.0.29 release, right? So with that, we're going to have the mandatory, the enabled by default, and the generally available features that are going to be really pushed into the platform, into your environment. And I like to bring this up because there's a lot of people that defer these, and now it's really getting to the point where you can't defer some of these major grid control changes. So that new grid control was introduced, I think it was almost 2 years ago now at this point in time. So an example is the save views, the personalization that you can add now, where you can define required views, the legal entity view support, where you can actually have different views for different legal entities, the grouping, the freezing in grids, the combo boxes, like all of those features now are going to be mandatory in this release, so you cannot disable them. So that's something to know, is that if you are still using, for example, even the old grid control, which I think I actually maybe even deprecated before, but if you're not using these other features, they are going to be enabled for your end users by default. So you may want to reach out to your partner or reach out to us if you are our customer of record to just talk through what that impact is going to be. Now, remember as well, there's another state that typically is assessed as well in these cross-app capabilities, and that is the enabled by default, right? And what that means basically is that when you do the upgrade, by default, they're enabled, but you can actually go back and then disable them. Now, why would you? I don't know. There might be some customization you've done that may impact this, but an example is like the save view for dialogues, those dialogue boxes that pop up. It's always been a pain in my perspective of actually tailoring those, especially for demonstrations when we do them, and for customers as well. So they added this save view capability for dialogues, and it's an awesome capability, but it's not mandatory yet. But it will be mandatory. Typically, these enabled by default are basically put to mandatory in the next wave release. So expect that then in 2023 wave 1, which will be our April release, to have these features that are mandatory as well. And so examples of those, like we're saying, are the save views for dialogues, the queries that you can save on tasks and single and double pages for it. So you can save query formats obviously with that. The tile sizes basically inside of the new workspaces. Obviously, you can change them now by 1 by 1, by I think it was 2 by 2, and I think there's a 4 by 4. Like there's small, medium, and large if you want to kind of look at it that way as well, where you can change those tile sizes to more reflect really what you want to be more pronounced inside of a workspace, right? The tabbing behavior, obviously, they've been going through and streamlining that, and then the action center loading is being optimized as well. And then GA, which will probably then in 2023 wave 1 be enabled by default, and then obviously in wave 2 will probably be required if they continue with this cadence. The save view support for workspaces. This is a really cool feature. If you haven't heard of it, you should look into it. Basically, what you can do now is you can actually take a workspace and then define a view, personalize it, right? Add columns, add controls, you name it. And then from there, you can actually save that as a view so that you can flip that workspace to many different perspectives as you go through that. And I'll show that just really quickly here because I do have a demo environment that has that up and running. So this is the new look and feel, right, of the actual vertical scrolling, not the horizontal scrolling, right? Workspaces that we have. And I'm actually looking at our credit and collections workspace that's inside of here. But you can see up here now, you've got this cool standard view, just like you do on your forms as well, right? So this is a really nice feature to be able to go through and then personalize these workspaces to maybe focus on, for example, a specific company. Maybe you've got different tiles that you want to have on here for different companies, and maybe you want to take those tiles, for example, and then change them to the 2 by 2, or open activity should be a 2 by 4 that's inside of here, right? So you can change those around really to reflect that information. So a really nice feature, a really nice quality of life type enhancement inside of here that just makes it easier for you to be able to obviously be more impactful on your personalizations for your end users as you go through this. And as an end user, I mean, just think of all the possibilities. I mean, you can now have different roles, segments, breakouts, and you're not customizing anything. It's all personalization, which is a fantastic capability of the Dynamics platform. Moving along here then, so one of the things I did want to mention, because if you're more technical in nature, you got to be watching out for this. So there are new service protection limits that are being put in place on the platform. And let's talk about that at a high level. So first and foremost, service protection limits are in place to make it so that, for example, when a particular process requests data within an environment, or is executing something, or is integrating obviously with it, that we're not compromising the integrity and performance of the production environment, right? That's the whole point of API limits. Now, some people get really frustrated with it because they're like, this makes no sense. Why do we have to have these? And then when you talk to IT people, they're like, oh my gosh, just imagine we had our database just go down because somebody opened up Excel and executed a query, and all of a sudden the entire environment went down, right? We're trying to avoid basically the latter as part of this. Now, what they've done is that they've actually introduced what's called user-based service protection limits now. So before it used to be like resource-based, where we could actually define a resource that accesses Dynamics. But if you were a user and you use the, OData connection, we'll just start there as an example inside of Excel to grab some data. Well, you're actually accessing an API, right, to be able to interact with it. So what they've done is they've basically added then a 5-minute window evaluation. So every 300 seconds, and it's a rolling window as we call it. So it takes the last 300 seconds, as you can imagine, and as you move forward, it keeps rolling that. But basically, if the number of requests or the execution time or the number of concurrent requests that a user has made now, so we're not looking at specific resources, we're looking at users that are accessing the system, are basically hitting that system with these service protection limits, they're going to get an error message. And this means as well then that if you have things set up where you're using users to actually authenticate, for example, for some of your integration scenarios, you may want to look at this. You may want to take a look because it's not an uncommon thing to have customers, for example, create automates that are accessing the system, and those flows, as you can imagine, could actually cause this to occur if they're using then a user as opposed to, for example, some type of Azure Active Directory application perspective with it, right? So just something to note. And what I would recommend with this is that there is documentation on this retry after interval for a lot of those types of integrations, where when it hits that limit, for example, for that user specific scenario, well, it gives actually kind of a timeout that can be used to then retry that operation in the future. So the limits up there, as you can see, number of requests, you can't do, I think it was 6,000 within 5 minutes. The execution time of all the requests in the last 300 seconds can actually exceed that of 1,200 seconds or 20 minutes. And you can't make more than 52 concurrent requests to the APIs in a 5-minute window, right? These are, I think that they're pretty big. If you're designing something fairly well in terms of an integration, you shouldn't be running into these types of scenarios, but I'm sure we're going to hear about them. I don't know why they didn't choose 42 for the number of concurrent requests, but if you get that joke, you know where I'm at with it. All right, let's keep moving here because we've got to talk about a couple of others as well. So with the cross-app capabilities, one of the other big things that's happening for our platform really revolves around the fact that we are becoming a one Dynamics, one platform concept. And that means that longer term here, we're going to see a deeper integration, for example, with Dataverse within the finance and operations platform. Now, there is conversation. I will say this. We can't say too much about it, but I think all of you should know this. There has been conversation. Is Dataverse the back end eventually for finance and operations, right? Why is Microsoft maintaining 2 different platforms, or even technically 3 right now, right, with Business Central? Why wouldn't they unify that more? And the big thing to note here, guys, is the fact that with finance and operations and with Dataverse, there is absolutely a deeper coupling that's occurring within those. Does that mean that we're going to get rid of our finance and operations development platform? More than likely not. I know that there are some people that say that it'll be on the back end in Dataverse. That's a lot of work. I think what will happen more often than not is that the front end interaction of it, meaning there may be, for example, a broker in front of basically these 2 platforms, and that broker basically will, path where data is going to go based upon the workload or application requirement need of the actual business process, right? So with that, though, they're enhancing then the cross-app capabilities to make this even deeper in terms of what that embedding is for basically Dataverse and for finance and operations. So first and foremost, they're doing the application lifecycle management. They're automating more of those dual right solutions solution deployments, so that when you actually go through and then set up, for example, a new environment inside of LCS, they're allowing obviously for more automation in that process, to basically stand up that dual write environment and then link them as part of the initial creation of the environment. They're introducing dual write, for example, now into really our Asia Pacific regions as well, right? So South Korea, China, South Africa, and Southeast Asia are part of this. South Africa obviously is more in the African continent, obviously, and then Norway obviously is going to be in Europe, but they're adding obviously then the dual write capabilities to those environments. And I know we've gotten personally questions about South Korea and China as part of our conversations with our prospects and customers. So this is a great thing to see as they continue to roll this out. The other aspect here is that the initial sync improvement, I think we've all of us have had that fun lookup limitation error message when we do our initial sync. They're really working on that for this next wave to make it easier. So basically at a high level, the maps obviously need some tender love and kindness with them, right? To get them a little bit more updated in terms of what those keys and references are, and even to get around those lookup limitations. So they're looking at uniformity with that to provide that for the next release, so that hopefully we'll be able to get to the point where we can just run an initial sync and not have to worry about some of those interesting error messages that we get upon setup of dual write. The other big thing I want to kind of just announce here is that they are focusing on dual write performance enhancements. We talked about dual write probably about 3-4 years ago, saying it was the future. Everyone laughed. Everyone's like, yeah, it's going to take forever to get to it. But we're here now. We've got lots of customers that are starting to use it as well. We've got lots of customers that are live with it. You know, one of the biggest complaints candidly has been that when you get into scenarios that have bulk data, like if you're importing 1 million contacts for some reason and it's a business requirement, and you've got that as a dual write integrated entity or table, if you're in Dataverse, right? The performance is abysmal for it. So what they've introduced is really what we call bulk data operations. And this is a concept inside of APIs. You know, OData has had it even in the OData standard, as I recall. You know, this is something that's been there, and people always say OData is not a good way to integrate. It's like, well, it can be if you actually have the bulk data operations that are exposed with it. So they are now exposing create multiple, update multiple, and upsert multiple for both the live sync and initial syncs that are occurring, obviously, with dual write. So these bulk data operations should hopefully help streamline really that performance when dealing with larger sets of records. Now, that doesn't mean that, you know, you want to use that as opposed to maybe a custom integration that you've created with it, but it's a great tool now to add to the toolbox to say, yeah, let's use then that bulk data operation with it. And kind of hand in hand with this, I'll skip past the admin experiences. Like I said, those are all updates that they do so that when you go, for example, into your data management section, that you click on it and you can actually see then if it's running and what the integration key is. They're just updating that experience. But the asynchronous support is also a nice new feature. So imagine you're in CRM and you're importing those 100, 1,000, 1 million contacts. Well, if you have that map set up for an asynchronous support, it's not going to stop you, right? It'll just go and asynchronously then insert the records, hopefully as well, then using the bulk data operation to be able to tackle that. So there's some really great capabilities being added then from a dual write perspective. Microsoft just continues to double down on this to say, yep, we're going to basically make this integration even better. And if you guys know, we've come a long, long way since the initial integration that we had back in the day with the data integrator, if you recall that as well. So a lot of great capabilities then for that one Dynamics, one platform concept as well. All right, so now we've kind of gone through a high level of the wonderful cross-app capabilities. Let's kind of look at what the finance features are that are inside of here that are pretty notable. So on the finance side here, so first and foremost, subscription billing was a feature set that was added. I think actually it was the last wave release for then being able to do subscription billing. And what they've done now is they've added now the ability basically to generate a quote from a billing schedule and also to split the billing to multiple customers on billing schedules. So if you haven't seen this new capability inside of Dynamics, where basically you can go into the subscription billing, you can basically then set it up, for example, to have an actual customer with a billing schedule. And with that billing schedule, you can have products that are on it, for example, and then you can have different price tiers and different pricing that's assessed with it, and deferrals and all this cool functionality, right, from a subscription billing perspective. They're just updating that, right? And this is really nice because a lot of customers are starting to talk about not just selling a product and installing it, for example, at their site. They're also talking about having a subscription fee related to that to maintain it or to service it at some level, right? Or even to have software that you subscribe to then that basically then enhances that product capability. So this subscription billing capability is fantastic in a lot of ways. It just provides a great base and platform then for you to start offering those types of services then to your customers as part of that. The other area that was really enhanced a lot in the finance section really is around this invoice automation and capture. And this is pretty cool. I really like these features because as I go through and even set up our automated OCR, for example, there's some interesting things that they initially had. So let's talk about that. So process during import, I got an exclamation mark there. What that really means then is that when you actually use, for example, the OCR import for the AP automation, what happened is that it would actually take that particular data, right? It would put it in the pending invoices. And then what would happen is that there would be a batch process, a batch job that would run that would validate, for example, the three-way matching as part of that process, right? So it became a background or a deferred process. And some of the feedback from customers has been, I don't want it to show up in the pending invoices. I just want it basically to go through and process to do the three-way matching. And if it succeeds in that, and I don't have, for example, a mandatory review in that process, I just want it to go through and then post it, right? So that way I don't have a pending invoice that I have to deal with at all with this. So what they've done is they've basically made it now so that it can do that. So as it imports, as opposed to working as a batch process in the background, it'll actually do all that processing. And if it actually is successful, it'll go ahead and post that, right? So it's a nice feature and quality of life enhancement from my perspective that helps with that. There's also image file management and a new hub and a deployment wizard that they've continued to update. They introduced a little bit of the deployment wizard in the last release. This one obviously is just getting deeper in terms of what it can deploy and set up for you so that we can automate more of these setups as opposed to doing it the manual way right now, which is how I typically have to go through and do it. But then also there's some advanced configurations that are being added as well. So you can have mandatory invoice fields that you can specify inside of your map now. You can actually have confidence scores that can drive errors. So that way, if a field was evaluated at a lower confidence, but it's still evaluated, right? But if the confidence is low, maybe you want that to be reviewed, right? So you want to flag that then for a mandatory review. And that mandatory review then as well is another step that they've added to this for a configuration where you can then set up rules that define then when a review needs to occur then for those invoice automation and capture events that you use then with the Dynamics platform. So a really great concept there and capability to be able to drive that a little bit further. So more of the finance stuff that's on here as well. So print payment advice for approved and sent. Payment advice. It always used to be sent, right? You'd have to go, and if you wanted to create that ahead of time, for example, you couldn't. Well, now you can. They added the feature that allows you basically to print that payment advice for an approved payment that you have in your payment journal. So that's definitely a nice quality of life enhancement because before I send it to the bank, maybe I actually want to print that information out, and maybe I even want to use document management to email that, right? To actually send that to a customer ahead of time. So or vendor for that matter. So that payment advice is a nice feature here to be able to now use that for both approved and sent. On the import of the bank statements, we can now reverse the debit and credit perspective with it. We've got ledger settlement automation that's been added as well. So this is actually a nice feature in my opinion. So we all talk about automation, right? And that seems to be a very common theme for all of our customers, is that they want to be able to, for example, automate the posting of something, or I don't want to touch something if it passes these particular requirements, right? Well, in this example, for the ledger settlement automation for advanced bank reconciliation capabilities, we can now set up what are called background matching rules that can run, that when you import the statement, for example, if that's even automated for that matter, you can then have it automatically go through and do those background matching rules. So that way, when you open up the bank settlement, it might actually be fully matched. And maybe in the future here, what they'll do is they'll make it so that if it's actually fully matched between the statement and the reconciliation process, that it would actually post it for you, right? So they're looking more and more in that settlement capability. And here's one for you. You always have one or two that you're like, oh my gosh, what the heck? We didn't have a bank reconciliation report. And I had to actually go into the system and look at this because I was a little bit in shock, because from an audit perspective, if you can think about it, I need to see both reconciled and unreconciled transactions on my bank reconciliation that I may need to supply to auditors. Well, we now have that report, right? So we had the report actually when it came to the basic bank reconciliation, but with the advanced capability, I'm assuming what happened is that was addressed usually as an export to Excel, or potentially as well as a custom report. So we now have that. It was an idea that was put on the ideas page from a customer perspective, and it got a lot of upvotes, and it's nice to see that being kind of polished off as part of that process. And then the last two here, the financial dimension service. So when dimensions are being calculated, this gets a little bit techy, but high level, think about like if you had 3 dimensions, and those 3 dimensions have 9 values inside of them. Exponentially, if you take that and try to figure out all the different combinations, that's a lot of data, right? And so if you have a lot of dimensions inside of your environment, the calculation to actually come up with the unique identifier of what that dimension set is actually a pretty time consuming and process intensive from a database perspective operation. It's got to go through and figure out, has that combination been generated before? If it's been generated, what is the ID with it? And if it hasn't been generated, what is the new unique ID that I'm going to give for that dimension set that we have? So what Microsoft did is they added this financial dimension service that's basically a microservice that runs externally that allows you to go through and do imports of long or large journal entries that have complex dimension structures and not be slowed down then when you're actually going through and doing your posting or importing or processing of those, because the financial dimension calculation is actually occurring in parallel with it, so that you're basically not slowing down the import or potentially the posting of journals inside of the solution. So this is a nice welcome enhancement to just make it better for scalability. And then lastly here, we've got the year-end close. When we do the closing, we could always obviously balance by dimension on the income statement, but we didn't have really a breakout on the balance sheet with that, as we went to obviously our equity accounts as part of that posting, or shareholders equity. Net result is that we now have the ability on the finance side to close as well by dimension on the balance sheet. So probably some scenarios, especially obviously with public sector or even fund accounting, where that could actually help obviously as part of your processing. All right, so that's the wonderful finance section. Let's start digging more into supply chain. So obviously Dynamics 365 supply chain management now has features that they've gone through and added, and there's some really cool ones, and there's one super big one I want to announce here that's pretty exciting to see as well. So a couple things to note. So from a supply chain management perspective, one of the features that Microsoft added really with the introduction or the rebranding of Dynamics 365 Retail when they turned it into this commerce product is that they added this inventory visibility API or front end that you can use then, for example, within your web shops, within commerce, or even use it from a custom integration scenario with it, right? Where basically you can get a quantity on hand of inventory very easily inside of a common API. And so this is used, like I said, in many different facets for businesses when especially when they're looking at, for example, a web store and they want to see the quantity on hand for it. So two cool things that they've added. So actually three technically. Number one, inventory visibility when it was first launched didn't work with WMS items. We now support WMS items. So warehouse management enabled items. As some of you may know, there's different setups and hierarchies that we use for that. And so obviously that can have an impact then on inventory visibility. So two of the features that they've added to this from the WMS item perspective is that they now have the ability to do what are called soft reservations and allocations. So soft reservations, I think pretty much all of us know what that is, right? If I bring it down to the most basic level, on a sales order, you put a quantity. The quantity on hand, for example, should actually then be decremented based upon the quantity that's on that order, right? But I shouldn't have to hard reserve or say physically I'm reserving this particular quantity, right? At a high level, that's what this inventory visibility now allows for as well, is that those soft reservations are reflected now inside of here so that you know what the soft reservation quantity is going to be then for a given product. The other thing that's important here is the allocations, and this is a bigger one that I've been asked personally about. Let's say you've got a warehouse and that warehouse has a quantity of 100 of a particular product. Let's say that you want to allocate 25 of those to your web shop or to a specific channel, right? So, or do you want to allocate 10 towards a specific customer, or you want to allocate, X amount to a certain location for that matter as well. So these allocation rules that can now be added are actually above, for example, than any transactions that you would do, meaning that if you want to now go through and then allocate a certain quantity towards a given channel, well, you can do that with allocations and you don't have to then create a sales order to drive that. It's an overarching allocation that's actually against then, for example, that particular quantity in that given site and warehouse. And I think it's actually at the site level for it. So a nice feature from that regard that, we can now start divvying up inventory without actually then having to enter in, for example, sales orders or transfer order transactions to hard allocate those as part of that process. And like I said, it's really common for web shops to have that where you want to have 50 on hand for anyone that comes in, for example, to a store to interact with it, but you also want to then reserve 10 of those, for example, then to web type interactions with it. So this allows for us basically to tackle those types of scenarios now. The other thing from an inventory visibility perspective, the on-hand inventory list. So basically, think about it this way. Every time you do an on-hand query inside of a database or an environment, you have a performance impact with it because it has to calculate very quickly what we have on hand based upon sales orders and transfers and basically our demand and supply, right? The net result here is that these on-hand inventory lists are cache data copies using that inventory visibility, where you can actually now have different views of that data that is now being maintained so that it's cached in memory to be able to provide those accurate values then to the other services that might be using inventory visibility. So a welcome enhancement in that regard. Some of the other ones then as well here that I want to cover that we get into some of the manufacturing. So make finished goods physically available before posting. So report is finished, as we all know, when we actually go through and post that, typically it's posting the related journals to it, right? That might be then also influencing the quantity related to it. And it takes a little bit of time then for those journals to post as you go through that process. Well, what they've done is they've made it now so that you can actually physically post now an inventory quantity out of a particular work center or resource for that matter. And when you actually post that, the put away and all the other WMS operations can be executed, but the journals are actually queued in a batch to be posted basically at a deferred time interval, right? So a nice welcome feature in that regard, especially like if you're in a high volume environment or if you've got low latency between your steps that you need to tackle, making it physically available to go through a put away process is a welcome enhancement where we don't have to now wait for the journals to post as part of that. So really nice feature in that regard. The other one as well I wanted to kind of highlight, obviously, is this make to order supply automation. And this is a pretty broad bucket that they put inside of the release notes. So, when we think about, for example, our capable to promise based capabilities, really what we're saying here is that we want to make it so that when we actually have, for example, a make to order event with CTP, for example, as well, we wanted to integrate more, for example, then with the data that is there to drive those decisions, right? So that way we know, for example, the production orders, where they are for firming, the fulfillment policies that are related to it based upon the customer setup that's inside of there, right? So they really focused on this release from a supply chain perspective to use more of that supply chain automation, especially in the make to order scenarios, to make that then easier when you go through that process. So just note that there's a lot that comes into that make to order supply automation. I've listed a couple of them on here, but that's going to be one that you're going to want to probably look at a little bit more, especially if you're in the make to order environment and not as much make to stock. Some of the other areas as well from a supply chain perspective, when we talk about planning, remember guys, the planning engine, they're getting to the final stretch here of making it basically in parity with our old master planning engine. So we're talking about planning optimization. We've got, for example, some really cool features with the demand-driven MRP, so DDMRP, decoupled lead times. I mean, a visual tree structure for BOMs as well has been added to this. This is an awesome concept, meaning, we're so used to in business systems going into products and setting up lead times, right, that we define then for a vendor and an item and the relationship with it. And what happens is we never go and update those, right? Well, decoupled lead times allow for basically DDMRP to go through and calculate based upon vendor performance what those true lead times are. So this is an awesome feature in regards to being more accurate with the lead times that are for your products, and being able to now see this and visualize it and understand it is a really welcome feature into DDMRP, along with the average daily usage, right? Because this is also then what says, all right, how much stock do we need to be able to maintain a specific service level agreement in the organization? Well, we need to know what that average daily usage is in our calculation, and they've added those as part of that DDMRP concept. So this DDMRP, like I said, this is going to start changing even more as they keep adding more features that revolve around making it automated in terms of understanding how much quantity I need and the lead times that are needed to be able to basically then manage my supply chain. The other areas that are just what I call parity features, meaning that we're finally getting back to what master planning had, and these are kind of the last ones, to be honest, is the batch disposition codes. If you're on AX 2012, you knew that that was something where we can actually earmark whether or not a product is available or not from a batch perspective, right? So that's been added now back into the planning optimization. The supply forecasts are there. The finite material scheduling now is inside of there even more. The sales quotations, right? I think in AX 2012, we even had a setup where in the master planning, you could define like at what percentage does that become a demand source, right? Well, they've added that now back into the planning optimization. And then also process manufacturing now is inside of the planning optimization engine. So, we're making some really good progress here from a planning optimization perspective. And I shouldn't say we, I should say Microsoft is, but this is awesome because we're going to finally have a more modern planning capability inside of Dynamics. And this is really, we're getting down to the last features in here before we can start focusing now on some of the newer DDMRP concepts, which is going to be very, very awesome to see. The other aspect here too then, so obviously with COVID, one of the things, and I misspelled, I apologize, the multi-vendor sourcing, but one of the things that was noticeable really was the fact that we've got to do some risk assessment scenarios that are inside of the solution. So part of this release focuses on introducing a dashboard that actually looks at, for example, your supplier risk assessment to figure out, obviously, on-time deliveries, what's been confirmed, what's our fulfillment rates, what's our purchase orders, on-time delivery rates for those purchases and customers, or suppliers, excuse me. So this is a welcome feature, right? So that you can do some risk analysis just kind of natively inside of the solution. And then the other one is the multi-vendor sourcing. A lot of rules around that. We talked about this on our leadership summits, our leadership connect, about onshore, nearshore, offshore, right? So in the new release here, we will now have what's called multi-vendor sourcing, where we can specify ratio rules then for that, where you can have a specific percentage fulfilled by one vendor and then from another vendor as well. And planning optimization, not master planning, but planning optimization takes this into account so that when it generates those planned orders, we now have that multi-vendor sourcing rules that are set up being respected. So this is a welcome feature, I think, for most of us that are in the supply chain environment. And then if we keep going here, because I want to kind of wrap up to leave a little bit of time for questions, on supply chain, on the WMS, there's been some nice enhancements to the WMS application. As you guys may have recalled, we now have a new WMS application where they took, for example, the old one. I think that was probably about a year and a half, 2 years ago that they introduced it. And basically what they're doing is they're adding enhancements now to it. So being able to look up, so for example, here I can type in a vendor name or a purchase order number, right? To be able to look up a purchase order and see that inside of the mobile app instead of scrolling to try to get to that information. So a really welcome and nice feature there. There's also this concept now of pause tasks. We call them detours. That was actually in the last release, but now we have detours within detours, where basically you can actually save a process, move to another process, finish that process, and then resume, for example, that prior process from the mobile app-based perspective. So a really nice feature in that regard, because we all know that in the warehouse, for example, even though you may not use the inline replenishment, maybe, for example, you see that a bin doesn't have a particular inventory quantity and you want to do the replenishment, but you were in the middle of a pick, right? Or maybe you see another product that you saw on your pick list that you want to do, even though you started another one, right? So this just allows, obviously, for you to take those detours and kind of give that empowerment then to the warehouse staff, who are typically, they know typically where things are and what they're interacting with. So those detours are a welcome feature inside of the environment. The other feature that's in here now, guess what, guys? We can pack shipments now inside of the WMS app. So before you had to go to that pack screen, as you recall, to go through and do packaging inside of Dynamics. Now you can basically pack the inventory into containers, create containers, and close the containers all within the warehouse management mobile app. So this is an awesome feature. I'm so happy they added it. Think about it this way: instead of using, for example, that pack screen, you could actually now set up a tablet at the packing center and then at that log in from there and use that mobile app experience, which is better for fingers and interacting with data from a visual perspective. It's easier to interact with it, right? So nice feature that's being added here to help then with kind of those more digital scenarios that you may have inside of your warehouse. One of the big things I wanted to really announce is kind of the tail end here is the fact that there has been a huge focus by Microsoft to create what's called a guided warehouse implementation experience. Now, I know a lot of our team might be cringing at this because there's always that special little difference that's out there, right? But at the same point, I will say this, that when we go through demonstrations, that it is very rare that we start seeing a lot of people deviate from standard functionality. They can, obviously, but that doesn't mean that they should. And the nice thing about this is the fact that the new rapid implementation configuration that they've actually added then for this guided warehouse really, in a lot of ways, reduces the need then to have specialized consultants come in to do that setup. And I absolutely love this, and I know a lot of people at Stoneridge do as well, because What it means is that you guys can own data more and set up more, and it's not this complex beast to set up, which it shouldn't be, right? So how have they tackled this? Well, they're adding, for example, wizard-driven setup of the WMS setup, right? So that you can basically hit the ground running quickly with that. The warehouse configurations are wizard-driven now as well. They've got a simplified view, obviously, of the location directives. They've got simulations now that you can do of those location directives, so you don't have to actually go and create a sales order and create a pick then from that particular order or work for that. You can actually simulate it, and then you can also visualize it as well. So this is a very welcome feature to help our customers and you really going through the setup then obviously of supply chain. And I expect this concept, for example, to extend into other areas in the future, potentially even manufacturing, to make this an easier experience for setup for our supply chain capabilities.